So I've had some very interesting and thoughtful comments on the channel. In spite of my basic obscurity, it's still really amazing and gratifying to me that anyone actually pays attention to all the crap I say about a bunch of music that, for the most part, is pretty obscure. So I wanted to engage with a few of those comments today. In particular, I'm going to be focusing on people who disagreed with my opinions, and I'll be considering their thoughts, considering their comments, and deciding whether or not they changed my mind about the song or the album under consideration. So I'll be starting with disagreements on the Peter Hammill videos, then disagreements on the Genesis song rankings, and then I'll finish with people who disagreed with my video about Porcupine Tree's closure continuation. So basically going there in ascending order of how many people got pissed off and how pissed off they got. Now, lots of people have said flattering or complimentary things, or have expressed agreement when I took a position I thought was risky or controversial. And of course, I'm very appreciative of that, but the focus here is more, people who disagreed and whether or not I ended up changing my mind based on their thoughts. As always, I'm Hans from Electric Brain, Electric Shadow. We are a contemporary art rock project which seeks to make music that's complex but emotionally accessible. Check us out on Bandcamp or your favorite streaming service. Now, before I get into the comments, this does seem like as good a time as any to address a mistake I made in the Genesis song videos, which is, nobody seems to have picked up on this yet, so maybe I shouldn't say anything, but the song Duke's End is not listed there. Now, when I first did the rankings, I had Duke's End and Duke's Travels combined into one. I decided at some point they should be separated because I had separated another song where you had kind of an outro at the end of a long piece, which was Cinema Show and Isle of Plenty. Seemed to me like those should be split into two entries, so I also split the Duke's Travels and Duke's End, or meant to, rather, but then forgot to put Duke's End in the ranking. So, just imagine that Duke's Travels and Duke's End are combined into one entry, and try not to think too hard about the inconsistency there with how those kinds of somewhat similarly joined songs have been addressed. So I wanted to start with some thoughts about my Peter Hammill videos. You may remember I did videos ranking the Peter Hammill albums by decade. And, some of those I think were a little bit more controversial than others. The 70s albums, there's not too much of a quality spread there, and everybody I think likes all those albums about the same. So with the 70s entries, there might have been people who put them in a different order, but there was nobody who objected too much to the order that I had. Now, the 80s were a different story. One thing that was particularly controversial was, I'm not necessarily as big a fan of the K Group studio albums, Inner K and Patience, as a lot of other people are. So some thoughts here from Pete Langman. Interesting perspectives. I often cite film noir as an example of perfection in 4/4 rock drumming, equal to Back in Black, and Ellis's guitar solo is just outrageous, especially his use of a wah pedal. Grant Pinton says, abstract philosophical material is what got me into Peter Hammill in the first place, so Inner K is my fave, with Patience close behind. Oolong Oolong says, although I appreciate Guy Evans's drumming, I certainly wouldn't call him one of the best drummers in the world. I should say here I'm not actually qualified really to say who the best drummer is at any level beyond hearing things and going, hey, that's cool, which I do a huge amount of when I hear Guy Evans. But I am, for instance, totally ignorant of jazz drumming and jazz drummers. And drums are the only major rock instrument that I really don't play at all. So I am, in fact, unqualified to make the sweeping statement that I did, and he's probably got me there. Anyway, continuing with that comment, my favorite of Hamill's 80s albums is Patience, which I think is structurally top-notch. None of the songs outstays its welcome. Lyrics are emotional and often philosophical at one and the same time. Vocal delivery is superb, and the melodic content is memorable on every song. So like I already mentioned, the K-Group albums are a little bit of a blind spot for me, honestly. I like some of the writing more than others, and like I mentioned in the video, the live work that they did around that time, especially as documented on the Margin Plus, is so exciting. The arrangements and some of the interplay is so interesting on those albums that it's always felt to me like the studio versions maybe don't have the same level of snap and complexity that they should. I think I mentioned that inner K in particular is a little bit kind of abstract, dry, philosophical. But, the commenters here, all three of these folks have really excellent points about the objective merits of those albums. Oolong Oolong in particular is, using language very similar to the language that I use to praise Peter Hammill that I like, right? So he's done a really good job there of making a case for it in the terms that I kind of think about and evaluate. So, I do keep planning. I do plan to keep coming back to these two albums. I think at some point they might click a little bit more than they have so far. I'm actually going to hold off on saying whether my mind is officially changed about Patience and Inner K, but I think I'm willing to definitely entertain the possibility that they have positive qualities I may have missed. So still talking about the Hammill 80s video, Daniel Phoenix says, Loops and Reels better than As Close as This, Out of Water and Skin better than the K Group. You lose all credibility and I couldn't listen to your critics. I think he meant critiques there. But anyway, like I said a minute ago, I'm certainly willing to concede the possibility that there are things happening in the two K Group albums that I'm not appreciating. Since I did the 80s video, I've also spent more time with And Close as This. I think that there's some songs there that are more affecting than I gave it credit for. There are also some things that are maybe kind of clunky or over earnest or don't have the subtlety that they could. But I like that album more than I did when I did the reviews. All that being said, it really has surprised me how little love there is for Loops and Reels and Out of Water. Loops and Reels, it has absolutely magical atmospheres. Those atmospheres are produced by very daring, intelligent experimentation that was cutting edge for its time. Those cutting edge textures are combined with great melodic synths and some of his most odd and enigmatic lyrics. It might be a little bit slow in places, but the power of it when it clicks is so significant. And, everything I love about Hammill as an artist is on display on that album. And Out of Water, lyrically, it has a huge amount of wisdom and detail and depth. It has some very, very compelling melodies. It has remarkably lush, detailed, creative production. And some of the production and arrangement might sound a little bit dated at a first listen, but you can tell that he's straining as hard as he can against the limits of what can be done with his budget and technology. So while I think that some of the other 80s albums I may have undersold a little bit, I have to admit that having seen the general kind of what seems to me to be the underrating of Loops and Reels and Out of Water, I have to admit I'm actually really glad to have been out there advocating for them. So on the topic of where to put those two albums in the ranking, or the general assertion that they rule, mind unchanged. Now, the 90s work has a bunch of stuff in it that nobody really seems to like very much, so even though a couple people maybe proposed alternate rankings, which might put one or two things higher than I did, for the most part, people were pretty understated about any disagreement. Nobody, from what I could tell at least, nobody's really going to leap to the defense of X My Heart or The Noise. There were some disagreements from the 2000s, though, and I actually found these two comments really interesting to juxtapose against each other, both from folks that we've heard from already. So Oolong Oolong says, I'm intrigued by your enthusiasm for this decade of Peter Hammill's work. Incoherence is utterly dreadful. Hammill has flogged that old problem with language issue to death. Clutch is the only album from this decade I have any fondness for. The lyrics are powerful and hard-hitting in the manner of, say, The Future Now or PH7, and the acoustic guitar theme works well. Now, contrarily, we have Grant Penton. I'm interested in why you rated the magnificent Incoherence so low. Restrained Peter Hammill just doesn't impress me, and Clutch sounds like one of his weakest to me. Now, these are both smart, articulate commenters. They both know Hammill's work probably as well as I do, and their opinions are mirror images of each other, right? So what to do with this? As far as Incoherence, man, I just feel nothing emotionally when I listen to it. The sonic textures are harsh and ugly, but not so harsh as to be satisfyingly heavy. The melodies mostly don't really register as melodic, and I would probably agree that the lyrical theme does feel like an extended restatement of what might by this time have been overly familiar ground. But at the same time, it's such an ambitious project, and it's so determined to disregard anything that might be regarded as conventionally appealing musical qualities. And it's so conceptually focused that I really can't at all dismiss it or agree with calling it dreadful. Clutch, meanwhile, is, I think it's probably uneven in its quality, maybe more uneven in its quality than I fully admitted to in the review. It does have a few songs that I feel some urge to skip when I go through it. But when the melodies do connect, I think it has some of the best melodies he's ever written. And it has a definite sense of emotional earnestness and moral solidity that I really can't help admiring. So ultimately, I'll say that I appreciate the thoughts of both commenters here, but if I had to do it again, I'd probably leave the ranking the same, and with the greatest respect, I'd say for this one, mine is unchanged. Moving ahead into the 2010s, there was a little bit of a stir over how much I liked the covers album In Translation. Now, I mentioned at the time that I did that video that album was fairly new to me. I hadn't had the chance to spend a lot of time with it. That remains true. That being said, Adam Kimmel says, "What? In Translation is the worst Hamill album ever. Thin sounding, his voice stretched and straining, an absolute waste of time. From the Trees is far better and more consistent." Xavier Alvarez says, "I think From the Trees deserves more praise. Milked could have been on any album from the past. Maybe with a fuller arrangement, we could all see what a great song it is." Now, I don't know if I realized until I did that video how many people seem to hate In Translation. Most of the reviews and the early buzz that I'd read was fairly kind to it. I still haven't put an enormous amount of listening time in with that album since it came out, and that fact might be telling, I suppose, but it felt like enough of a stylistic departure, and it felt conceptually interesting enough, particularly with the places where he was translating lyrics from foreign languages into English. I've been fairly biased toward it. Honestly, looking through the track list now, I don't know if I could tell you off the top of my head how most of these songs actually go. So, maybe the fact that I haven't immersed myself in it the way that I have a lot of his other work maybe is significant. I don't think that the vocals sound radically more strange than anything he's done in the last 10 years or so. I'm not sure I would agree with that. The arrangements perhaps aren't as lush as some things that he's done, but I think there's enough there to support the compositions. It probably is thinner sounding than some things from the last 10 or 15 years, but I don't know that when I listen to it, I don't think to myself, boy, I wish there were another guitar or synth line here to fill things out. I mean, I don't think it needs to be any thicker than it is. Now, regarding From the Trees, I'm willing to concede that I might be prone to underrating it due to its simplicity. I've been back to it a few times since I did the video, and, some of the things that bothered me are still factors there. I think some of the lyrics still kind of feel like almost sort of an assembly of cliches. It takes an awful lot of focus to hear some of the depth in the arrangements. The accusation of thinness that was leveled toward In Translation maybe you could make that same criticism of From the Trees, and I may actually have thought more about thinness of sound when I was listening to From the Trees. It does, though, have a wisdom and a maturity and an emotional depth and an honesty that is moving, and I think that is characteristic of a lot of his best stuff. We'll see how I feel in a year or two, but I might tentatively have to admit that I probably could put From the Trees higher than In Translation. I'm actually going to give these guys a mind changed for this one. All right, so that actually seems like a good stopping point for now. Next time, I think I'm going to have a different topic video next week, but in 2 weeks I'll come back with the second half of the What Did I Get Wrong response to comments video. At that time, I'll be addressing the reactions to the Genesis song rankings and to the much beloved review of Closure Continuation by Porcupine Tree.